A racist police officer kicked an elderly black man inside a courtroom without knowing he was a decorated U.S. war veteran, and the entire room gasped when the old man fought back with a force no one saw coming. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. In a place where justice was supposed to prevail, humiliation unfolded instead, in front of judges, lawyers, jurors, and citizens who dared not lift a finger. The old man wasn't even given a chance to explain, to breathe, to be seen as human. Without a shred of hesitation, without a moment to question his own blind hatred, the officer stormed across the courtroom, shouting, "You people don't belong here unless you're in handcuffs." His heavy boot struck the old man's chest with brutal force, knocking him backwards into a bench as the entire room fell into stunned silence. The old man's cane clattered to the floor, and his battered military medals pinned to his jacket shimmered under the fluorescent lights, unnoticed by the blind rage of prejudice. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even there to testify. He was there to be honored for his service in a small, overlooked ceremony that was supposed to happen that afternoon. But because of the color of his skin, a man who had bled and fought for the very freedoms the courtroom stood upon was treated like a piece of trash. People turned their faces away. Some muttered under their breaths. No one moved to help him up. No one, except the old man himself. He stared up at the officer, bruised but unbroken, his fists tightening at his sides, the weight of every indignity he had suffered across decades of a divided America rising inside him like a storm. His voice, raspy yet thunderous, filled the courtroom. "You picked the wrong old man," he said, standing to his feet with a quiet dignity that made even the judge sit back in shock. The police officer sneered, stepping forward again, but this time, the old man did not fall. This time, history itself stood behind him. The tension in the room was electric. The spectators barely breathed as the confrontation grew. Whispers raced across the gallery. Is he really going to fight back? That officer's in trouble now. No one knew the full story yet. They didn't know that the man they just watched being humiliated had survived battles overseas so fierce that entire towns back home held candlelight vigils for him. They didn't know that medals of honor, bravery, and sacrifice had once been pinned to his chest by presidents and generals who saluted him with tears in their eyes. They didn't know that when the old man lifted his hand, it wasn't just to defend himself, it was to defend every forgotten soul who had ever been spat on and stepped over. And when he reared back and struck, not out of hatred but of righteous defense, something extraordinary happened. The courtroom, once cold and indifferent, turned into a witness to a long overdue reckoning. The officer stumbled back, stunned, and the weight of his own actions began to crash down on him. What followed wasn't just a fight. It was a reckoning. But how did the situation escalate so quickly inside a courthouse where the old man was supposed to be honored, not humiliated? What led the officer to act with such immediate contempt without knowing the truth? And most importantly, how would the tides turn once the real identity of the old man came to light, exposing secrets that no one in that room was prepared to confront? Stay with us until the end to find out how a moment of cruelty spiraled into a powerful lesson of justice, redemption, and an unforgettable act of courage that would change every life in that courtroom forever. Before we dive into today's story, we want to send a powerful message to every black viewer watching. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, injustice, and discrimination of any kind. You deserve respect, dignity, and equal treatment, always. This platform is a safe place where your voice, your story, and your journey matter. Now, get ready for an emotional and powerful story that will stay with you long after it's over. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community that believes in justice and respect for all. Enjoy the story. The heavy gray clouds sagged low over the city of Montgomery, Alabama, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps where dreams were too often broken and dignity too often stripped away. Inside the old building, polished marble floors echoed the hurried footsteps of attorneys, jurors, and officials, all rushing to maintain the mechanical rhythm of justice, a rhythm that seemed to beat differently depending on the color of your skin. It was into this charged atmosphere that 78-year-old Elijah Brooks stepped, moving slowly but purposefully, his left hand gripping a weathered cane carved decades ago by his own father, his right hand adjusting the medals carefully pinned to his modest brown jacket. His shoes were scuffed from years of loyal service, his eyes a deep well of memories, losses, and victories most in that room could never begin to fathom. He wasn't there to argue a case, nor to defend a crime. Elijah had been invited for a small, unofficial ceremony recognizing his service in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, a tribute quietly arranged by a few sympathetic court clerks who had stumbled upon his forgotten records during a dusty file room audit. Elijah Brooks was a man built from resilience. Born in the segregated South during the final years of Jim Crow, he had learned early that the world would not offer him fairness. His parents, sharecroppers with strong backs and worn hands, had taught him to walk tall even when he was forced to walk alone. At 16, driven by a hunger to see a bigger world and earn respect the streets of Montgomery would never give him, he lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army. Through blood, sweat, and pain, he carved out a reputation as a man of unshakable loyalty and unimaginable courage. His battlefield stories, though rarely shared, told of nights under foreign stars, of saving brothers in arms who sometimes couldn't bring themselves to share a meal with him because of the color of his skin, but who would, in the chaos of war, trust him with their lives. He had been decorated multiple times for bravery, had stared death in the face, and had returned home expecting a nation that would finally acknowledge his worth. Instead, he had been greeted with indifference, suspicion, and doors slammed in his face. Still, Elijah never surrendered to bitterness. He returned to Montgomery, built a modest life, worked in a local post office for 3 decades, raised 2 children who grew up to break barriers he could only dream of crossing. His wife, Loretta, a schoolteacher with a laugh like summer rain, had stood beside him through every hardship until cancer claimed her 5 years ago, leaving Elijah with only memories and the steady echo of her voice urging him to keep his dignity no matter what. His daughter Angela became a fierce civil rights attorney in Washington, and his son Marcus served as a firefighter, risking his life daily in a city that still struggled with its old demons. Elijah lived alone now, in a small, lovingly kept house filled with photographs, worn furniture, and an American flag folded carefully in a glass case over the fireplace. The courthouse itself loomed over him as he approached, an ancient relic of authority where change came slow and prejudice clung stubbornly to the walls like old smoke. Inside, officers in crisp uniforms moved through the corridors, most indifferent, some suspicious. Elijah was used to the wary glances. He was used to being sized up, dismissed, and occasionally sneered at. What he wasn't used to, what he hadn't expected, was the boiling rage barely concealed behind the eyes of Officer Travis Malone, a man built like a bulldozer, with a buzz cut, a permanent scowl, and a heart hardened by years of internalized hatred and unchecked authority. Travis Malone had grown up on the outskirts of Montgomery, in a neighborhood where Confederate flags still flew proudly from front porches and racial slurs were tossed casually into daily conversation. His father, a former deputy himself, had filled his son's head with stories about the good old days when people knew their place. Travis had listened, absorbed, and carried those lessons into adulthood, cloaked in a thin veneer of professionalism that barely disguised the contempt simmering underneath. When he became a court officer, he treated each day as a battleground, an opportunity to assert dominance, to remind certain types that they were always one step away from being put back in their place. Promotions had eluded him, complaints had piled up, but the system protected its own, and Travis remained, a festering wound on the institution he claimed to serve. The collision between Elijah and Travis was inevitable. It was fate drawn from a deck stacked with generations of anger, pain, and ignorance. As Elijah entered the courtroom, shuffling carefully along the aisle, the weight of his age and memories heavy on his shoulders, Travis saw only a target, not a man. Travis saw a black man standing tall where he believed he should kneel. He saw a symbol of everything he hated, everything he feared losing, and without pausing, without verifying, without questioning, he acted. Travis stormed across the room, his boots clapping aggressively against the marble, his hand already hovering near his belt, as if expecting resistance that wasn't there. The words he hurled were cruel, laced with venom, words Elijah had heard before but never from someone so young, so reckless. "You people don't belong here unless you're in cuffs." The blow came fast, a brutal kick that sent Elijah sprawling backwards, his medals scattering across the floor like forgotten tokens of a war that few remembered and even fewer cared about. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators instinctively stepped back, others stared, wide-eyed, at the scene unfolding in front of them. Elijah lay there for a moment, not just stunned by the pain, but by the sheer audacity of it, the sheer disrespect. Around him, faces blurred into a mosaic of guilt, fear, and indifference. The judge, an older white man with thinning hair, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. The clerk at the desk lowered her eyes. Even the defense attorney nearest to Elijah hesitated, torn between decency and self-preservation. In that frozen moment, Elijah felt the weight of every slight, every indignity, every moment he had been told, silently or aloud, that he was less. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his cane, steadying himself, forcing his battered body upright. His voice, when it came, was low but firm, reverberating through the courtroom with the gravity of a man who had nothing left to fear. "You picked the wrong old man," he said, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. Travis sneered, his face flushing red, a mixture of anger and something else creeping in, something almost like fear. He stepped forward again, fists clenching, ready to strike once more, blind to the gathering storm he was about to unleash upon himself. Across the room, quiet murmurs began to swell into louder voices. A young woman pulled out her phone, recording the confrontation. A few jurors whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting from confusion to outrage. There was something different about this old man, something they couldn't yet name but could feel in their bones. The air grew heavy with a tension so thick it seemed to vibrate against the walls. Outside the courthouse, life went on as usual. Traffic buzzed past, families shopped for groceries, children laughed on playgrounds. Inside, however, a reckoning was beginning, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of that old stone building. Elijah Brooks stood not just for himself, but for every soldier overlooked, every worker underpaid, every soul dismissed because of the color of their skin. This day had started with the simple intention of acknowledgement, a quiet ceremony to honor a life of service. It would not end that way. The seeds of justice, long buried beneath layers of silence and fear, had found fertile ground in the most unlikely of places, inside the heart of a man who refused to bow, even when the world demanded it. What would happen next would shock everyone in that courtroom. But for now, the stage was set, the players in place, and history itself waited, breathless. The room seemed to vibrate under the heavy silence that followed Elijah's quiet defiance. People shifted in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing an act of madness or a moment of something far bigger than themselves. Officer Travis Malone's jaw clenched tightly, the muscles in his neck pulsing with restrained fury as he stared down at the man who dared to stand against him. Every instinct in Travis's body screamed to finish what he started, to assert dominance before any seeds of doubt could root themselves in the minds of those watching. His pride, fragile and bloated, demanded satisfaction. He stepped closer, his boots grinding against the polished floor with an almost menacing rhythm, his voice dripping with contempt as he spat out, "Sit your ass down before I make you." Elijah remained still, his posture erect, his cane gripped firmly in one hand, his medals still glinting like small silent witnesses against his chest. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he answered, "You will not lay another hand on me, son." The use of the word son wasn't accidental, it carried the weight of a life lived through generations of battles, seen and unseen, fought on muddy fields and in broken courtrooms alike. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. Travis's face twisted in anger, but before he could act again, Judge Whitmore's voice cut sharply through the air. "That's enough, Officer Malone. Step back." The judge's words held authority, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Judge Whitmore, a man nearing retirement, had spent decades balancing justice against public expectation, often tipping that balance in favor of the comfortable status quo. He knew Officer Malone by reputation, knew his record was tainted with complaints of excessive force and discriminatory behavior, but had chosen the safer path of looking the other way too many times. Now, the consequences of that inaction stood before him in the form of an old black man refusing to be crushed. Travis hesitated, his hand twitching at his side, his breath heavy and ragged. He turned slightly to the judge but never took his eyes off Elijah. He resisted, Travis muttered through clenched teeth, his voice loud enough for the courtroom to hear, planting seeds of justification before any official inquiry could begin. He made a threat. The words hung awkwardly in the air, nakedly false, and the murmurs among the spectators grew louder. A woman sitting near the back leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "That's a lie." We all saw it. The neighbor nodded grimly, pulling out his phone and tapping quickly, already composing a message, already deciding that the world needed to see this. Elijah took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of many eyes on him, knowing that whatever happened next would not just be about him. It would be about every young boy who looked like him, about every elderly man who carried invisible scars from battles fought both abroad and at home. The clerk, a young Latina named Marissa, stood up shakily from her desk and approached the bench, whispering urgently to Judge Whitmore. The judge listened, his face paling as he glanced toward Elijah and then back to Marissa. A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, passed across his features, but he quickly masked it behind the practiced neutrality of his position. "We're going to take a short recess," Judge Whitmore announced, banging his gavel lightly. Everyone remained seated. "Officer Malone, please escort Mr. Brooks to the side room for questioning." The command was a thinly veiled attempt to de-escalate, but everyone in the room knew what it truly meant: move the problem out of sight. Travis smirked, reaching out with a heavy hand to grab Elijah's arm. Elijah flinched instinctively but refused to move. His voice rang out, strong and clear, filling every corner of the courtroom. "I walk under my own power, and I answer to no man who treats me like less." The atmosphere thickened. Even Travis, fueled by years of unquestioned authority, paused at the raw power in Elijah's words. For a moment, just a heartbeat, uncertainty flashed across the officer's face. But pride, as it often does, overrode caution. Travis gripped Elijah's arm harder, pulling him toward the side room with unnecessary force. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. Witnesses gasped audibly. Marissa watched, her hands trembling, the papers on her desk forgotten. Inside the side room, a sterile chamber with blank walls and a battered wooden table, the confrontation took on a darker, more intimate tone. Travis shoved Elijah into a chair, looming over him, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think you're better than the rest of them?" Elijah sat calmly, meeting Travis's glare with steady, unblinking eyes. "I don't think," Elijah said quietly. "I know my worth. Something you'll never take from me." Outside, the courtroom buzzed with rising energy. Word was spreading fast: an old war hero assaulted by a racist cop inside the very halls of justice. Journalists began to appear in the hallways, drawn by the scent of controversy. A young black attorney named Jasmine Carter, passing by on her way to another case, paused when she heard snippets of the story. She immediately recognized the magnitude of what was happening and began dialing contacts, her voice urgent. "Get the community leaders down here," she said. "Now. This isn't just about him. This is about all of us." Meanwhile, inside the side room, Travis leaned in closer, his voice a poisonous whisper. "You should have stayed quiet, old man. You should have known your place." Elijah's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. "My place is wherever I stand," he replied, his voice as steady as granite. "And yours is about to be decided by the world you can no longer control." At that moment, the door swung open and Judge Whitmore entered, flanked by Marissa and two senior officers, both visibly uncomfortable. The judge's voice was strained but official. "Officer Malone, you are relieved of your duties pending review. Step away from Mr. Brooks." The word struck the room like a thunderclap. Travis whirled around, his face contorted in disbelief. "You can't be serious," he barked. "He resisted. He attacked me. The judge's face was stone. "We have witnesses, officer. And we have footage. Step away. Now." Reluctantly, Travis backed off, the humiliation of being reprimanded in front of colleagues burning hotter than any fire he had ever known. Elijah remained seated, his expression unreadable, but inside his chest, his heart pounded with a complex mixture of rage, relief, and profound sadness. It shouldn't have taken a room full of cameras to validate his humanity. It shouldn't have taken blood, humiliation, and public spectacle to remind people that dignity isn't something you have to earn. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd was beginning to form. Word of mouth, social media, and sheer outrage brought citizens to the steps, holding signs, shouting for accountability. Veterans, black and white alike, began arriving in uniform, medals pinned to their chests, standing silently in a show of solidarity. Jasmine Carter moved among them, organizing, directing, preparing for something larger than a single protest. She understood instinctively what Elijah knew in his bones: this wasn't just about one man. This was a line in the sand, a moment to decide whether silence would continue to be complicity. Inside, the tension continued to mount. Travis sat stiffly in a chair outside the courtroom, waiting for union reps and legal counsel, his mind racing with panic and fury. His father's voice echoed in his head, bitter and angry: "Never let them win, boy." But deep down, beneath the rage and denial, a gnawing fear had taken root, a tiny sliver of recognition that perhaps, for once, the tide had truly turned. Elijah was escorted back into the main courtroom, not in handcuffs, but with quiet respect from the senior officers who now understood at least part of who he was. As he walked down the aisle, heads turned, phones rose to capture every step. Somewhere near the front, a young girl stood on a bench to see better, her eyes wide with wonder, as if witnessing the march of history itself. Judge Whitmore took his seat again, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled papers he didn't need to read. He cleared his throat and said, "Before we proceed, the court needs to address an incident that occurred earlier today involving Mr. Brooks." His voice wavered, and for a brief moment, he looked as though he might be swallowed by the enormity of what had transpired. The courthouse doors swung open again. A new figure entered, carrying with them a storm that no one in that room was ready for. Elijah turned, recognizing the face immediately, and for the first time that day, a genuine smile touched his lips. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, the outcome would shock everyone. The figure standing at the doorway of the courtroom was a woman, poised, commanding, wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit that seemed to cut through the tense air like a blade. Her heels clicked confidently against the marble floor as she moved toward the bench, her face set with a fierce determination that left no room for doubt. She carried a heavy leather briefcase in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other, and as she approached the judge's stand, a collective murmur rippled through the room. Elijah Brooks recognized her immediately, his heart swelling with a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. It was his daughter, Angela Brooks, renowned civil rights attorney, defender of the voiceless, the very embodiment of the dreams he and Loretta had once whispered about late into the Montgomery nights when hope felt like a fragile, flickering flame. Angela addressed the judge with a voice that was calm but filled with a force that made even the gallery lean forward unconsciously to hear better. "Your Honor," she said, her eyes steady, "I am requesting immediate intervention on behalf of my client, Elijah Brooks, whose rights were grossly violated under your watch, and whose honor this court has failed to uphold." She placed the manila folder on the judge's desk with a firm hand, sliding it forward like a gauntlet thrown down. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the folder and began flipping through its contents. His eyes widened the further he read, the color draining from his face. Inside were copies of Elijah's military service records, commendations from multiple presidents, photographs of a young black soldier dragging wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire, a personal letter from a former U.S. general thanking Elijah for his bravery during a classified operation that had saved dozens of American lives. And most damningly, there were sworn testimonies and previous complaints filed against Officer Travis Malone, detailing a long pattern of racial profiling, abuse of authority, and misconduct, all previously ignored or swept under the rug. The courtroom held its breath as Angela continued speaking, her voice cutting clean through the thick atmosphere. "My father," she said, glancing briefly at Elijah before fixing her gaze back on the judge, "is not just any citizen. He is a decorated veteran who fought for freedoms that are still, shamefully, denied to him in this very building today. And the man who assaulted him, without provocation, without cause, represents a stain not just on this courthouse, but on the very ideals he claims to protect." Travis, seated stiffly at the defendant's table now that formal charges had been filed, shifted uncomfortably, his face a storm of emotions, rage, humiliation, disbelief. His lawyer, a sweaty, balding man in an ill-fitting suit, leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, but Travis swatted him away like an annoying fly. He couldn't process this reality, couldn't accept that the world around him had finally, truly turned against him. Judge Whitmore set the folder down heavily and removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of defeat. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before, edged with a weary kind of remorse. "Officer Malone," he said, each word deliberate, "in light of the evidence presented, and the testimonies gathered, this court has no choice but to recommend immediate suspension pending full criminal investigation. Furthermore, pending the conclusion of this inquiry, you are hereby barred from entering any law enforcement facility in Montgomery County without express written permission." The courtroom exploded into noise, cheers, shouts of disbelief, the flash of camera phones lighting the chamber like fireworks. Travis surged to his feet, shouting, "This is a setup. This is a goddamn circus. He's just another thug playing the victim." His words hit the air like acid, but instead of stirring sympathy, they only deepened the pit he was digging for himself. Angela didn't even flinch. She turned toward him, her voice razor-sharp as she spoke above the commotion. "Thugs don't earn bronze stars. Thugs don't pull brothers in arms out of burning helicopters. And thugs sure as hell don't carry the respect of entire regiments who owe their lives to them." Travis opened his mouth to reply, but the doors of the courtroom banged open again, and in marched a group of elderly men, some walking with canes, others in wheelchairs, but all wearing pieces of military uniform, hats, jackets, medals proudly displayed on worn chests. They were white, black, Latino, a brotherhood forged in blood and sacrifice. They lined up silently behind Elijah, forming an impromptu honor guard, their presence alone a statement louder than any words. The judge pounded his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but even he could not deny the sheer gravity of what was happening. Elijah stood quietly, his hands resting on his cane, feeling the tide shift inexorably in his favor. He had not asked for this parade of righteousness, but he accepted it now, not just for himself, but for every man and woman whose sacrifices had been forgotten. Travis slumped back into his chair, the fight draining out of him as reality pressed down like a mountain. His lawyer leaned in again, this time more forcefully, whispering something urgent. Travis's face twisted in pain, but he finally nodded, resigned. The lawyer rose and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client wishes to issue a formal apology, and resign his post effective immediately." Gasps echoed through the room. It was a stunning reversal, one no one had dared predict when the morning began. Travis stood, his voice hollow, his eyes darting everywhere but at Elijah. "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words sticking like thorns in his throat. "I disrespected a good man. I acted without cause. I was wrong." The apology rang shallow, but the resignation was real, and the courtroom knew it. Elijah regarded Travis for a long moment, then nodded once, not out of forgiveness, but out of a solemn understanding that true justice didn't always come gift-wrapped in sincerity. Angela stepped closer to her father, placing a hand lightly on his arm. She leaned in, her voice low so only he could hear. "You did it, Daddy. You stood taller than any of them ever could." Elijah didn't reply right away. His eyes scanned the room, the judge, the officers, the spectators, the young girl watching him with wide eyes from the gallery. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this moment was not an ending. It was a beginning, a breach in a wall that had stood too long, built on generations of fear and silence. The judge adjourned the session, but few moved to leave. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown into a sea of bodies, their voices rising together in a chant that shook the windows, "Justice for Elijah. Justice for all." As Elijah and Angela exited the courtroom, the crowd parted for them like a tide, strangers reaching out to shake his hand, to thank him, to honor him. Television cameras followed their every move, reporters shouted questions, but Elijah paid them no mind. He lifted his head to the gray sky, felt the first drops of rain touch his face, and smiled. Inside the building they left behind, Travis sat alone, staring at the empty courtroom with hollow eyes. His world had shifted, crumbled, and there was no going back. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of the lives he had dismissed so carelessly, the weight of the history he had tried to ignore. And yet, even as the rain fell and the chants grew louder, Elijah knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. But today, for once, a good man had stood against the tide, and the world had been forced to see him. What happened next would only deepen the shock, and reveal a connection between Elijah and Travis that would leave everyone speechless. The rain came down heavier as Elijah and Angela moved through the crowd outside the courthouse, people reaching out, some simply brushing their fingertips against Elijah's sleeve as if to absorb a piece of his strength. News vans parked along the curb had their satellite dishes extended into the sky, and reporters clustered near the entrance, shouting questions that melted into the roar of voices chanting for justice. Elijah kept his pace slow, steady, feeling every drop of rain soak into his jacket, feeling every heartbeat of the crowd merge with his own. Angela stayed close, her hand firm on his arm, guiding him through the throng toward the courthouse steps where a makeshift podium had been hastily set up for an impromptu press conference. Before they could reach it, a sharp voice called out from the side, cutting through the chaos. "Wait," it said, desperate, raw. Elijah turned to see Travis Malone standing at the bottom of the steps, his uniform jacket removed, looking smaller now, stripped of the power he had once worn like armor. His face was wet, though whether from rain or something deeper, no one could immediately tell. The crowd fell silent, every eye locking onto the scene unfolding, every phone raised high to record. Angela stepped forward instinctively, her body tense, ready to shield her father from anything further. But Elijah gently placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. He looked at Travis, really looked at him, seeing not the uniform, not the anger, but the broken pieces of a man who had been crumbling long before today. Travis's voice cracked as he spoke again, lower this time, barely above the sound of rain hitting the pavement. "I didn't know," he said, his words halting. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know." Elijah stared at him, the weight of decades pressing down on his chest. His voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "You didn't care to know," he said, the truth hanging heavy between them. Travis flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling against something inside himself, something that no apology could erase. "I found out," Travis said, his words tumbling out in a rush, desperate to be heard. "After they took me out of the courtroom. I called my father. He's the one who told me." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "He told me, my grandfather, he fought in Korea. He was part of the 24th Infantry Regiment. He was wounded, almost died in an ambush. And he said a soldier pulled him out, under fire. A black soldier. Saved his life." The crowd murmured, shifting restlessly. Elijah's hand tightened on his cane, his face unreadable. Travis's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible. "It was you. My grandfather, he owed his life to you." Angela gasped softly, her fingers digging into Elijah's sleeve. Elijah remained silent, the rain dripping from the brim of his cap, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. He hadn't remembered every face from those desperate days, hadn't kept track of every life saved and every life lost. But he remembered the battles, the fields soaked in blood and rain, the screams, the chaos, and the quiet moments when one life was all you could carry out of the darkness. The realization seemed to crush Travis, folding him inward. "All my life," he said, choking on the words, "I was raised to hate people like you. To look down on you. And the man who made my life possible, was you." Elijah finally spoke, his voice so low and heavy it seemed to pull the air itself down. "Hate doesn't just blind a man," he said, staring directly into Travis's shattered soul. "It robs him. It robs him of truth, of honor, of everything good he could have been." Travis collapsed onto the steps, his head bowed, hands covering his face as the weight of everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, crumbled around him. The crowd watched, silent now, the rain soaking into their clothes, their skin, their bones. There was no victory chant, no cheer. Only the cold, solemn recognition of how deep the wounds of hatred could run, and how high the cost. Angela pulled gently on Elijah's arm, murmuring, "You don't have to say anything more, Daddy. Let's go. You don't owe him anything." Elijah nodded, his body weary but his spirit fierce. Yet as they turned to leave, he paused. He looked back over his shoulder at Travis, who still sat hunched and broken on the courthouse steps. "You don't owe me an apology," Elijah said, his voice carrying over the rain-soaked crowd. "You owe yourself a better life than the one you were taught to live." Then he turned, walking away with Angela beside him, the crowd parting once more to let them through. As they moved through the gathering, Elijah felt a hand brush against his. He turned to see a young boy, no older than 7, holding a homemade sign scrawled in bold letters, "Thank you." Elijah crouched slowly, ignoring the pain in his knees, and smiled at the boy. "You're welcome, son," he said softly, ruffling the boy's hair. The boy beamed, and for the first time that day, Elijah felt a true warmth spread through him, battling back the cold weight that had settled over his heart. The sun began to push through the rain clouds, shafts of golden light piercing the gray, illuminating the courthouse and the people gathered before it. Reporters called after Elijah and Angela, but they didn't stop. They had said everything that needed saying. This day belonged not to the cameras, not to the headlines, but to the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a man who had stood when the world tried to make him kneel. Behind them, Travis remained seated on the steps, the file on Elijah's life still open on the bench beside him, pages fluttering in the breeze like restless spirits. Somewhere deep inside, a new battle had begun, the fight to tear down everything he had been taught, to rebuild from the ruins of his own shattered ignorance. Whether he would win that battle was a question only time could answer. Angela helped her father into the waiting car, shielding him from the rain with her jacket. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them like a shield. Elijah leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion and the emotion wash over him. "You okay?" Angela asked softly, her hand wrapping around his. Elijah opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a tired but steady smile. "I'm better than okay," he said. "I'm free." The car pulled away from the courthouse, leaving behind the crumbling walls of old prejudice and stepping forward into the uncertain light of a new day. But even as they drove away, Elijah knew this was not the end. Justice, like freedom, was a garden that needed constant tending. He would not live forever, but the seeds he had planted today would grow, watered by the courage of those who had watched, listened, and chosen to see. And somewhere, back on those courthouse steps, a broken man sat in the rain, finally beginning to understand what it meant to be free. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and gleaming under the hesitant light of the setting sun. Inside the moving car, Elijah Brooks sat quietly, staring out the window at the passing cityscape. His reflection stared back at him, weathered, calm, but undeniably changed. Angela drove with both hands on the wheel, her jaw set, her mind working furiously through the events that had just unfolded. There was a storm of emotions between them, unspoken but thick in the air, and it wasn't until they were well away from the courthouse that Angela broke the silence. "Daddy," she said softly, keeping her eyes on the road, "you didn't have to say what you said to him. You didn't have to give him anything." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He watched a group of children playing in a park they passed, their laughter carrying faintly into the car. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "I didn't say it for him," he said. "I said it for the boy he used to be. The boy who might have been something better, if someone had loved him enough to teach him right." Angela gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting back tears. "But he hurt you. He humiliated you. He would have buried you if he could." Elijah turned to look at her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Hate grows like a weed," he said. "It chokes everything around it. If you only rip off the top, it grows back thicker. You have to get down in the dirt and pull it out by the roots, even if it cuts your hands doing it." Angela blinked hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from the ugliness of the world, but he had lived through too much to need her protection. What he needed now was understanding, and she realized with a pang that even she had underestimated his strength. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Travis Malone sat in a deserted hallway, the echoes of the crowd long since faded, the buzz of the media moving on to the next scandal. He stared at the floor, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions at once. His lawyer had abandoned him the moment the cameras disappeared, leaving him alone to sift through the wreckage of his career, his identity, his beliefs. He felt hollow, as if the very marrow of who he thought he was had been scraped clean. The words Elijah had spoken echoed endlessly in his ears: "You owe yourself a better life than the one you were taught to live." For the first time, Travis allowed himself to wonder what that life could look like. What it would mean to break free from the chains he hadn't even realized bound him. But every possibility he considered was tangled in fear and shame, in the gnawing doubt that maybe it was already too late for him. He thought about his grandfather, the man he had idolized, and he wondered how he would face him now, knowing the truth. Would the old man be proud of him? Or ashamed? And worse, had his grandfather's sacrifice, and Elijah's bravery, been wasted on someone like him? Travis buried his face in his hands, feeling the enormity of the question crushing him, and he realized, with painful clarity, that redemption was not a thing you were given. It was a thing you had to fight for, day after day, choice after choice, against the pull of everything you had been taught to believe. Across town, Elijah and Angela sat in the kitchen of his modest home, the house warm and filled with the faint smell of coffee brewing on the stove. Angela paced the floor, her energy restless, while Elijah remained seated at the table, a newspaper spread out in front of him, the headline screaming about the courthouse incident. His name was everywhere now, a reluctant hero thrust into a spotlight he had never sought. He sighed heavily, folding the paper and setting it aside. Angela stopped pacing and faced him. "What now?" she asked, her voice tight with uncertainty. "They want interviews. They want you to speak at rallies. They want you to become the face of this movement." Elijah shook his head slowly. "I didn't stand up so they could put me on a pedestal," he said. "I stood up because it was right. That's enough for me." "But it's not enough for them," Angela said, frustration creeping into her tone. "They need someone to lead. Someone to inspire." Elijah smiled sadly. "The world doesn't change because one man stands alone," he said. "It changes because many men and women, unseen and unthanked, choose to stand together." Angela sat down heavily across from him, rubbing her temples. "So what do we do?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering. "We live. We teach. We fight in the small ways that matter, every day. And maybe, just maybe, we help someone else find the courage to stand when their moment comes." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the answer she needed. She nodded, blinking away tears, and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Travis found himself standing outside a small, weathered church he had passed 1,000 times without ever really seeing. He stood there for a long time, the evening air cool against his skin, debating whether to go in. Through the open doors, he could hear the faint strains of a gospel choir rehearsing, their voices lifting into the night like a balm against the pain he carried inside. For reasons he couldn't explain, he stepped inside. The old pastor, a black man with silver hair and kind eyes, noticed him immediately but said nothing, simply nodding in welcome. Travis sat in the last pew, feeling the unfamiliar weight of humility settle over him. He listened to the choir, to the words of hope and forgiveness woven into their songs, and he felt something shift deep within him. A small, fragile thing, but real. As he sat there, Travis realized that he was standing at a crossroads, a rare and terrible gift. He could choose to cling to the hatred that had shaped his life, to wallow in self-pity and blame. Or he could choose the harder path, the one paved with humility, accountability, and the slow, painful work of becoming a better man. He thought of Elijah Brooks, of the quiet dignity with which he had faced everything thrown at him, and he knew there was only one path worth taking. Outside the church, the stars began to pierce the night sky, each one a tiny reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light could find a way through. Back at Elijah's home, Angela's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and frowned. "It's the mayor's office," she said, glancing at her father. "They want to honor you with a formal ceremony. Medal of Honor. Full recognition. Everything you should have gotten decades ago." Elijah's face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. He thought of all the years he had spent invisible, all the sacrifices unnoticed, all the doors closed in his face. Part of him wanted to refuse, to reject the hollow pageantry. But another part, the part that thought of the little boy with the "thank you" sign, of the young woman who pulled out her phone to capture the truth, of the soldiers who had lined up behind him, knew this was bigger than his pride. He nodded slowly. "Tell them I'll come," he said. "But only if it's not just for me. I want it to be for every man and woman who served and was forgotten." Angela smiled through her tears, nodding fiercely. "I'll make sure of it," she said. The night deepened, and Elijah sat quietly, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. He knew the fight was far from over. He knew that injustice would not vanish overnight. But he also knew that something had shifted, something real and lasting. And he knew that whatever came next, he would face it standing tall, just as he always had. Outside, the world moved on, the gears of change grinding slowly forward, pulled by the courage of those who dared to believe that even the smallest act of standing up could move mountains. And somewhere, in a small church on the other side of town, a broken man knelt, not to beg forgiveness from the world, but to promise himself he would never be the same again. The next few days moved slowly, filled with a strange combination of exhaustion and relentless momentum. Elijah found himself at the center of a story far larger than he had ever intended, his name woven through every news broadcast, his face splashed across headlines that labeled him a hero, a symbol, a reminder of a country still grappling with the weight of its own promises. Inside his small house, life carried on in simple, steady rhythms. Angela spent hours on the phone coordinating with city officials, veterans organizations, journalists, and advocacy groups, trying to manage the tidal wave of attention without losing the heart of what had happened. Elijah, for his part, stayed quiet, moving through his days with the same deliberate patience that had carried him through wars, protests, and the quieter, more insidious battles of everyday life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the living room in golden light, Elijah sat in his favorite chair while Angela paced in front of him, a sheaf of papers clutched in her hand. She read aloud the draft of the mayor's official statement, her voice tight with restrained anger. "We recognize the heroic service of Mr. Elijah Brooks and regret the unfortunate incident that brought his bravery to public attention." She stopped, throwing the papers down on the coffee table. "Unfortunate incident," she repeated bitterly. "They make it sound like you tripped on the courthouse steps, not like you were assaulted by one of their own." Elijah watched her quietly for a long moment before speaking. "They're afraid," he said simply. "Afraid to admit how deep the roots go. Afraid of what they'll have to tear down if they pull hard enough to get them out." Angela sat heavily on the couch across from him, rubbing her forehead. "And you're just okay with letting them sweep it under the rug with a few fancy words?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. But I know you can't rebuild if you burn everything down first. We have to be smarter than that. Stronger than that. Angela bit her lip, fighting back the surge of frustration and helplessness that had been building inside her since the day at the courthouse. She hated that it fell on the shoulders of the injured to teach grace to the oppressors. But she also knew her father was right. He always had been. A knock at the door interrupted their heavy silence. Angela rose, wary, but Elijah simply nodded toward the door. She opened it to reveal Travis Malone standing on the porch, his clothes plain, his posture stiff with uncertainty. His hands were empty, his face stripped of the arrogance and bluster that had once defined him. Behind him, the street was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of the streetlights. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Travis cleared his throat, his voice rough and low. "I don't expect you to let me in," he said. "But I need to say something. Please." Elijah nodded once, slowly, and Angela stepped aside, though her body remained tense, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of disrespect. Travis stepped into the living room, his eyes darting around the modest space, taking in the photographs on the walls, the worn furniture, the life lived in quiet dignity. He stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, before finally speaking. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. "I don't even know if it can be made right. But I needed to tell you, face to face, that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did. For what I believed. For what I carried inside me for so long without ever questioning it." Elijah watched him, his face unreadable, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. "You want forgiveness," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Travis swallowed hard. "I don't deserve it," he said. "I know that. But I'm asking anyway. Not to wipe away what happened. Not to pretend it didn't matter. But because I want to be better than what I was." Angela crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched. Part of her wanted to throw him out, to demand why it always fell to the victims to offer grace to the ones who hurt them. But Elijah's calm presence held her back, made her listen even when every instinct screamed to turn away. "You think saying sorry fixes it," Elijah said quietly. Travis shook his head quickly. "No," he said. "I know it doesn't. I'm not here for easy fixes. I need you to know that I see it now. What I was. What I became. I can't undo it. But I can't live with it either, not without trying to change." The room was thick with emotion, the kind that weighed heavy in the lungs, made every breath feel like a battle. Elijah sat silently for a long time, studying Travis with eyes that had seen too much, forgiven too much, and still refused to surrender to bitterness. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of a lifetime. "Change isn't something you talk about," he said. "It's something you do. Every day. Especially on the days it's hardest. If you're serious about it, you'll find a way to prove it. Not to me. To yourself." Travis nodded, a rough, jerky movement, his throat working convulsively as he fought back tears. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "Thank you for even letting me say it." Angela watched him go, 1,000 conflicting emotions warring inside her. As the door clicked shut behind him, she turned to her father. "Do you really think he'll change?" she asked, her voice brittle with skepticism. Elijah sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know," he said. "But hope is a risk you take. And sometimes, it's the only one that matters." The days that followed were a blur of preparations for the ceremony. Veterans from across the country sent letters, emails, small tokens of appreciation. Angela organized everything with ruthless efficiency, determined that her father's recognition would be more than a hollow political gesture. The mayor's office agreed to host the ceremony on the courthouse steps, the very place where Elijah had stood his ground, a public acknowledgement of the wrongs committed and the respect long overdue. As the day approached, Elijah found himself reflecting not just on the battle he had fought, but on the future that lay ahead. He knew the world would not change overnight. He knew there would be other Officer Malones, other courtrooms, other battles. But he also knew that every stand mattered. Every act of courage, every refusal to bow, chipped away at the walls that oppression built. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant blue stretched endlessly overhead. Elijah dressed carefully, his medals polished, his shoes shined. Angela pinned a fresh boutonniere to his lapel, her hands trembling slightly with emotion. "You ready?" she asked, her voice thick. Elijah smiled, a slow, steady smile that radiated from deep within him. "I've been ready my whole life," he said. They drove to the courthouse in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached, Elijah saw the crowd gathered, hundreds of faces, young and old, black and white and every shade in between. Signs waved in the air, "Honor our heroes, justice for Elijah, never again invisible." He felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, walking tall beside his daughter as they made their way to the steps. The mayor gave a short speech, his words careful, crafted, but sincere enough. He spoke of Elijah's bravery, of his sacrifices, of the nation's debt to him. And then he pinned a medal to Elijah's chest, the sunlight glinting off the polished surface, the applause thunderous and rolling like a wave. Elijah accepted it with quiet dignity, his eyes scanning the crowd, landing for a moment on a familiar figure standing near the back. Travis Malone, dressed simply, no uniform, no badge. His head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, a man still grappling with his own reckoning. As the crowd surged forward to shake his hand, to take photos, to offer thanks, Elijah felt something settle deep within him. Not closure, exactly, some wounds never truly closed, but a kind of peace. A knowing that he had done what he could, that he had stood his ground, that he had refused to be invisible. And as he looked into the shining faces of the young people pressing forward to meet him, he realized something even more powerful. This wasn't just his victory. It was theirs. It was the promise that their battles would be a little easier, their burdens a little lighter, because he had carried his with honor. Angela reached for his hand, her fingers squeezing tightly. "You changed everything, Daddy," she whispered. Elijah smiled, the weight of a lifetime lifting just a little. "No," he said. "We did." And under the bright, endless sky, surrounded by the echoes of a future still being built, Elijah Brooks stood unbroken, unbowed, and utterly free. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps as the ceremony slowly dissolved into smaller gatherings of people embracing, laughing, and wiping away quiet tears. Elijah stood near the base of the steps, shaking hand after hand, posing for pictures he never thought he would be asked to take, feeling the weight of so many strangers' gratitude pressing against him like a tide he could not hold back. Angela hovered nearby, a steady presence in the chaotic swirl of faces, making sure no one overwhelmed him too much. It was strange, Elijah thought, to have spent so many years moving through life invisible and now to be seen so vividly by so many. Yet he remained grounded, rooted in something far deeper than recognition, something that had been forged in the lonely fires of his youth when applause had been absent, and dignity had been its own reward. As the crowd thinned slightly, a familiar figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was Marissa, the young court clerk who had first discovered Elijah's service record and had insisted on organizing the original quiet ceremony before everything exploded into a national moment. She approached tentatively, her eyes bright with emotion, a file folder clutched to her chest. Elijah smiled warmly at her, sensing the nervous energy radiating from her. She paused in front of him, struggling for a moment to find the right words, then simply thrust the folder into his hands. "I thought you should have these," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We found more, records, letters, things from your service. They were buried deep. I guess no one thought they mattered enough to keep in the main archives." Elijah accepted the folder with gentle hands, feeling the heavy weight of history contained inside it. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the pages, the faded photographs, the worn commendations, each one a testament to a life lived in service, a life too long overlooked. He looked up at Marissa, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, and the young woman nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying. Angela joined them, her hand slipping around her father's elbow as she glanced at the documents. "They can't erase you anymore," she said quietly. "Not now. Not ever." Elijah smiled at her, a small, tired smile, and nodded. "The truth has a way of finding daylight," he said. "Even after a long, dark night." The conversation was interrupted by a quiet commotion at the edge of the crowd. Travis stood there, once again dressed simply, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't try to approach the podium or insert himself into the ceremony. He simply waited, eyes lowered, as if unsure whether he even deserved to breathe the same air. After a moment, Elijah caught sight of him and gestured subtly for him to come closer. Angela stiffened but said nothing, her loyalty to her father warring with her contempt for the man who had wronged him. Travis approached slowly, each step hesitant, like a man walking across thin ice. When he reached Elijah, he removed his cap, holding it respectfully in his hands. "I just came to say goodbye," he said, his voice rough. "I'm leaving Montgomery. I can't stay here. Not after everything. Not with what I did." Elijah studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Finally, he spoke, his words deliberate. "Running doesn't fix anything," he said. "It just moves the pain somewhere else." Travis swallowed hard. "I know," he said. "But I need to figure out who I'm supposed to be. And I can't do that here. Not with everyone remembering me for what I was." Elijah nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Wherever you go," he said, "remember that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about never stopping the work. Every day, you choose who you are. Every day, you decide whether to be better or bitter." Travis's eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. "Thank you," he whispered. "For not giving up on humanity. Even when people like me gave you every reason to." He turned to go, and as he did, Elijah called out one last time. "When you find the man you're meant to be," he said, "make sure you're someone worth the sacrifice that saved you." Travis paused, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion, then continued walking, disappearing into the crowd, into the uncertainty of his own future. Angela let out a shaky breath, tears streaming freely down her cheeks now. She turned to her father, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice muffled against his jacket. "You didn't just change him, Daddy. You changed all of us." Elijah held her tightly, feeling the weight of generations in that embrace, the battles fought and the victories won, small and large, each one a thread in the fabric of their survival. He thought of Loretta, of her laughter and her stubborn hope, and he knew she would be smiling somewhere, watching over them. As the ceremony wound down, Elijah was approached by a delegation of younger veterans, men and women who looked at him not just with respect, but with reverence. They asked him to speak at their meetings, to mentor them, to help them carry forward the fight for recognition and justice. Elijah listened carefully, his heart swelling with a new sense of purpose. He realized then that the battle he had fought was not ending, it was evolving. His story, his scars, his strength, would become tools in the hands of the next generation. Later that night, back at his home, Elijah and Angela sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the dark velvet sky. They spoke little, the silence between them comfortable, filled with the things that didn't need words. Elijah sipped sweet tea from a glass, feeling the cool breeze against his skin, and let his mind wander. Angela broke the silence eventually, her voice soft. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Not fighting harder. Not demanding more." Elijah thought for a long moment before answering. "You can't force someone to see your worth," he said. "All you can do is live it. Every day. And hope that eventually, the world catches up." Angela nodded, wiping her eyes. "I think it finally did," she said. Elijah chuckled softly. Maybe just a little, he said. But there's always more work to do. They sat there until long after midnight, the stars wheeling overhead, the night alive with the quiet hum of a world that, for all its flaws, still carried the seeds of hope. As he finally rose to head inside, Elijah paused at the door, looking back out over the city he had called home his whole life. It had not always been kind to him. It had often been cruel, indifferent, or hostile. But it was his. And he had claimed his place in it not by demanding it, but by living so honorably that the world had no choice but to recognize him. And somewhere, miles away, in a small rented room, a man who had once embodied hatred sat alone, staring at the letter he had begun writing but hadn't yet found the courage to send. A letter of thanks. A letter of apology. A letter that he hoped, someday, he would have earned the right to deliver. Because redemption, Elijah knew, was not a destination. It was a road, long and winding, paved with daily choices, daily sacrifices. And for the first time, he believed that even the hardest hearts could find their way if they dared to take the first step. And with that quiet, unshakable faith, Elijah closed the door behind him, the future waiting, vast and full of possibility. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow blossoming of a long-dormant seed. Elijah found himself at the heart of a growing movement, but he refused to let himself be used as a figurehead or token. He chose his moments carefully, lending his voice to causes that aligned with his principles, mentoring young veterans who looked to him not just for inspiration, but for guidance on how to hold their heads high in a world that still too often tried to bow them low. He spent his mornings at the community center, speaking to students about dignity, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to live honorably even when the world does not immediately reward it. His afternoons were often spent with Angela, who continued to build programs in his name to support black veterans, a tribute not just to her father, but to every invisible soldier who had ever been asked to sacrifice without recognition. On a crisp afternoon in October, Elijah stood once again on the courthouse steps, this time not as a defendant of his own humanity but as a guest of honor at the unveiling of a new plaque installed in the courtyard, a permanent tribute to veterans of color who had served the nation with valor. As he pulled the cloth free and the polished bronze gleamed in the sunlight, a hush fell over the crowd. Elijah traced his fingers over the names etched there, some he recognized, most he did not, and he felt a profound peace settle over him. He had not lived in vain. His battles had not been forgotten. In another corner of Montgomery, Travis Malone's journey was less public, but no less important. He worked quietly, out of sight of cameras and headlines, volunteering at shelters, helping in programs for veterans, sitting through workshops on racial healing and reconciliation that forced him to confront the ugliest corners of his soul. It was not easy. It was not quick. Every day was a struggle against the pull of old habits and the weight of shame. But he kept going, fueled by the memory of the man he had wronged and the silent challenge Elijah had laid at his feet, be better than what you were taught to be. One day, many months later, Travis mailed a letter. It was not addressed to Elijah. It was addressed to Angela Brooks, with a simple note inside explaining that he knew he did not deserve Elijah's forgiveness, but he wanted to honor the man by making amends in any way he could. Attached to the letter was a sizable donation to the foundation Angela had started, made in Elijah's name, with strict instructions to remain anonymous if she chose to accept it. Angela sat with the letter for a long time, feeling the complex knot of anger, pity, and reluctant respect slowly unravel inside her. Redemption was messy, she thought, and maybe that was how it had to be. Elijah never spoke of Travis again, never sought updates on his progress, never gloated in the knowledge that he had changed a man's path. He didn't need to. His victory was not in breaking his enemy but in refusing to become him. That was a kind of justice far deeper than any court could deliver. At home, Elijah continued to live simply, tending his small garden, attending Sunday services, spending evenings on his porch watching the stars bloom across the sky. His health remained steady, his mind sharp, and his heart, once burdened with so much pain, seemed lighter now, buoyed by the knowledge that he had weathered the storm and come out standing tall. Angela visited often, bringing her 2 young children who clambered into Elijah's lap, demanding stories of the old days, when heroes fought not with superpowers, but with courage and kindness. Elijah told them the truth, not just about the victories, but about the struggles, the setbacks, the endless small choices that made a man who he was. He wanted them to know that greatness was not in the medals you wore, but in the moments you chose to do the right thing when no one was watching. In the years that followed, Elijah's name became more than a symbol. It became a story passed down through generations, a living reminder that dignity is a quiet rebellion in a world that tries to steal it away. Monuments were built, scholarships were funded, but none of it mattered as much to Elijah as the simple moments when a young black boy would look up at him with wide eyes and see, not a victim, but a survivor. A warrior. A man who refused to be erased. As for Travis, his life remained humble. He became a counselor for veterans struggling with anger and adjustment, using his own failures as a warning and his hard-won lessons as a guide. He never asked for recognition, never sought to clear his name. He understood now that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future where you no longer needed to hide from it. On the 10th anniversary of the courthouse incident, a small, private gathering was held at the monument. Angela stood at the podium, her children grown, her voice steady as she spoke of her father's legacy. The crowd was filled with people whose lives had been quietly changed because one man had refused to bow to hate. Among them stood Travis, older now, grayer, but carrying himself with a kind of humility that spoke volumes without needing a word. Elijah's chair sat empty beside the monument, a single white rose resting on the seat, a symbol of a life well lived, a battle well fought, and a legacy that would outlive stone and memory alike. And so Elijah Brooks's story did not end in anger, nor in silence. It ended in hope. In change. In the countless small victories of people who chose, every day, to stand a little taller because one man had shown them how. Now, to you listening to this story, I invite you to reflect. How often in life do we turn away from injustice because standing up feels too costly, too heavy? How many moments have slipped through our fingers because we believe that one voice, one act of courage, could not possibly change the world? Elijah Brooks's story reminds us that it is precisely those quiet stands, those moments when no one else dares, that shape history. It reminds us that dignity is not given. It is claimed. And sometimes, claiming it inspires others to find their own. What about you? If your moment came, would you stand? Would you be ready to carry the weight of your convictions even when the world tries to knock you down? I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment sharing what this story meant to you, what emotions it stirred, what reflections it left behind. Your voice matters. Your reflections matter. Let's keep this conversation alive. And if you found value in this journey, if you believe in the power of stories that twist, inspire, and open our hearts to something greater, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and join us as we continue to bring you powerful stories that stay with you long after the last word is spoken. Thank you for being here. Until next time.